All right, welcome class. This is our week 15 lecture presentation as we are wrapping up the term, just a couple short weeks left. I wanted to discuss the final essay with you all, so we're going to look at Casebook Studies tonight, this week, and let's go ahead and get started. So, as you may recall, from the very first week of class, I asked at the beginning of the course, why do we study literature? And I contended that as students, we often learn who, what, where, and when of literature. So, like, who are the writers? What did they write? Where did they write? When did they write it? But we don't necessarily always ask the question, why? So either why did they write it, or why do we even study it? So what is the purpose? Why do we go at this thing called literature? And I thus far have had the focus of the years 1919 to 1970 because my answer to the question was that we study literature in order to understand the individual voice of a culture or a time or of history. And so that was my answer to the question. So I wanted to focus solely on works that were written within the civil rights era of history in order to see, is my answer correct? Do we study literature in order to understand a particular time, culture, or history? And that was my idea. So hopefully I'm right. At least I hope that you've found that I'm right, but we'll see. What I want you to do for the final paper is to come up with your own answer. And we're doing that in light of these casebook studies. So if you think back to the different works that we've read so far, we can go through different writers like Raymond Bradbury or Chinua Achebe, and we can look at these writers and say, how did they fit into this time period and to this particular time in history, which it was tumultuous, and we know that it was the rise of the civil rights era. We know that people were starting to look at things on a global scale in terms of the world wars that happened within this time period, looking at equality, looking at the individual in terms of individual rights. And so we see that reflected in the work. So, such as in modernist literature, it reflects a time of breaking from traditions. So that's the rebellion against the Victorian ideas and attitudes. It's also a time when they look at characters and look at individuals on a more realistic basis as they are flawed individuals, and how that kind of reflects the time as well. So that was my idea. But we can look at these authors, and that's kind of the point of the casebook study, is we can look at individual authors and determine their place in literature and determine the significance of what they were doing. So your job for the Casebook Studies essay is to share your interpretive answer to the question of why we study literature. And through that, you're going to choose a particular casebook study from our textbook with that question in mind. So I wanted to go over kind of the choices, and there are several, and you'll notice that some of these fit in the time period that we've been reading so far, and some of them don't. And I'm completely fine with you choosing any of these, whatever piques your interest. So we have in Chapter 10, we have a focus on Edgar Allan Poe and Flannery O'Connor. Obviously, Flannery O'Connor is part of the era that we've discussed. Edgar Allan Poe is a little bit before. We have Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Yellow Wallpaper, and Alice Walker's Everyday Use. Both of these fit close enough into the era that we're discussing. A little bit before, but not much. And then we have Emily Dickinson, who is obviously not during that time period, but Langston Hughes is. Chapter 32 talks about T.S. Eliot in a particular work. We also have some real throwbacks in terms of chapter 36 and 37, Casebook Studies on Sophocles and Shakespeare. So those are our two drama chapters in terms of looking at the different casebook studies. And so these are not at all in the time period we're looking at, but we can still determine why do we study literature from these works. So each casebook study in the textbook, they're called critical casebooks, and each chapter of casebooks includes a lot of different information. So they have a discussion of each author in terms of just biographical information. They share several stories or poems or plays to read from that particular author. Of course, we have some chapters that focus just on one work, but in the sense of the poems, they have multiple. Sometimes there's multiple stories, so it depends on the chapter, but generally they're going to share several things by the author for you to read. And then there's also critical articles about the works. And so in terms of the essay assignment, I am asking you to use source material, and part of that source material, or all of that source material really, could come from these critical analysis. So I have the description of the assignment here. So you are to use at least 2 sources outside of the casebook study documented in MLA citation, and it needs to be 500 to 700 words. Now I'm going to say outside of the works by the author, so if you're listening to this, you probably get a little more insight. So at least 2 outside sources outside of the author. So if you chose Langston Hughes, you may look at 3 or 4 of his poems, but you need to have at least 2 more sources outside of those poems, whether that is from the critical essays in the casebook study or outside research that you do. So each casebook study will conclude with a list of questions. And they're entitled Writing Effectively. So I have a picture here of one of the pages from the chapter about Emily Dickinson and Langston Hughes. So you can see what that looks like. So your job is going to be to choose a casebook study that interests you, and you're going to choose one work or more from the author that you choose, and choose one question from Writing Effectively to pursue for your paper. Now you may find that you want to do more than one question, as long as it all fits into your paper, as long as you have a clear flow of ideas and a clear single thesis statement. I'm okay with that, but you should be able to write a 500 to 700 word essay based on one of these questions. And keep in mind, like I mentioned earlier, though we have focused on the years 1919 to 1970 as a class, you are not restricted by these years for your paper. So you can choose any of the chapters, any of the authors represented in our textbook. So let's talk about analysis real quick, because these papers are going to be an analysis based on the question that you choose from Writing Effectively. So a literary analysis is basically what you're going to be doing, and this is more than a book report. If you remember book reports that you did in elementary and middle school, you read a book and then you summarized the book, and sometimes you would share if you liked it or not, or recommend it to others to read. This is not what an analysis is. Instead, you're looking beyond the initial reading of the text and examining things on a deeper level. So you're going in to look at a work through the lens of analysis. So some questions to think about. You could think about how the author attempts to convey themes. You can look at or think about things like literary techniques that we've discussed in class so far. So this could be characterization, theme, mood. It can be tone, diction. Think about all the different things that we have talked about as in terms of voice and all the different literary elements. You can utilize those in your analysis. So showing how the author uses these literary terms, how the author utilizes these different techniques to convey a particular point in answer to the question that you choose. Think about what lies beneath the test. What's the significance or importance that you find after reading the work? So here are some things to consider when you are working toward your paper. Make sure that you read the piece of literature or pieces of literature many times. So don't just read it once and expect to be able to write a paper about it. So you need to be able to note important passages. If it's a poem, you're going to have to be able to break it down line by line, just like we did in the discussion boards throughout the term. You need to be able to look at this in a deeper level, so reading it more than once is going to be important. Decide upon the literature's themes and author's purposes. So look at theme, look at purpose. Why is the writer writing this? And connect that to the question that's being asked in the text. Are there similarities between different works? Are you going to choose to write about more than one? What literary elements are incorporated into the work? Then keep collecting information until you have enough to develop your topic thoroughly, whether that is from researching the articles that are right there in the textbook or doing outside research. Just collect information according to the question that you are being asked, and then determine your point of view. What is your answer? How will you analyze the works? What perspective will you take? Think about, in light of the question in the textbook, in light of our overall class question, and how they relate to the author. Look at why does this connect to studying literature? How does it connect to studying literature? Some organization tips. Okay, so you want to start your paper with an introduction paragraph, and it needs to include a clear thesis statement. Now, a thesis statement, as we may recall from previous courses or from our first paper, this is a 1 to 2 sentence statement that lets the reader know what the point of your paper is. What's the topic? What's your point of view about the topic? How do you plan to prove it? So in this particular paper, you need to make sure that you include the author that you are studying, the work's titles or title, and also your point of view, considering the question that you choose. So be sure to include a brief summary of the works. Now, I don't want the whole paper to be the summary, but you need to include the summary because that will help kind of set the tone for the rest of your paper. Now, you can include the summary in your introductory paragraph. You can include the summary in one paragraph in the body of your paper, but it needs to be there sometime at some point. I suggest toward the beginning. And then in each body paragraph, take a different approach to proving your thesis statement. So use examples from the text. You can use direct quotes. You can paraphrase. You should, of course, cite those if you include them. You should include information from the articles that critique the work or the author right there in the textbook. Show how each main idea in the body paragraphs prove that thesis statement. And then bring everything all together with a clear conclusion. So let's look at some examples on how to do this. So I took a question from the text about Langston Hughes, and the question is, discussing a single poem by Hughes, examine how musical forms, such as jazz, blues, or popular song, help shape the effect of the works. So with that, I came up with this thesis statement. So Langston Hughes' musical influence is apparent in his poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, through the repetition of phrases and line construction and the blues-like themes of the African American collective journey through turmoil and hope. So what I've done here is I have stated the author, Langston Hughes. I have stated the poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I also addressed the question. So how do musical forms help shape the effect of the work? So here we have a musical form that's representative. So repetition of phrases, and I have blues-like themes. So I actually connect to a specific type of music and how that connects to the poem. So here you can see that I've answered the question from writing effectively in a thesis statement. And now I can construct my whole paper to prove my point of view. So let's look at that construction. So this is just an example of real quick organization of a paper. So I'll have an introductory paragraph, and in that I'm going to summarize the poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, and then I include my thesis statement in that paragraph. And the next section of my paper is going to be part of the body of my essay. The first section I'm going to talk about repetition and how the poem uses repetition and how that relates to music. So I'm going to talk about chorus-like qualities at the beginning and ending of a poem, what a chorus is in music, its significance in music, what's the point of having a chorus, and then I'll share examples from the poem itself that show that it does have a chorus-like quality. And then I will look at the repetition of I phrases in the poem. There's actually a good stint of I phrases in the middle of the poem, and how those establish Black identity and how that relates to music, and how repetition is used in blues. So I might give some examples from different blues music that relates to the time period that Hughes actually wrote the poem. And then I'll have another section in the body of my paper about the themes that connect to blues music. So rivers are a major theme in blues music, and so I will show how it connects to the poem, and perhaps I'll look up, some different songs and writers of blues music that use rivers and waterways in their music. And then I will have a section there that talks about the collective theme of African American ability to endure turmoil. And then, so I'll show that in the poem and how that connects to the overall African American endurance of turmoil. And then I'll also look at the theme of hope in the poem and in blues music as well. And then I'll bring it all together in a conclusion. I'll restate the thesis statement in a new way and summarize my main points to bring it all together. So that's just an example. If you guys were really interested in this particular poem, I'm not completely opposed to you using my organization here. I do want you to have your own thesis statement, though, so you can't just copy what I have. But you're welcome to pursue this particular topic. So keep in mind for this week, make sure that you read the rest of the Glass Menagerie and respond to the Week 15 discussion board questions. Of course, you're watching the Week 15 lecture presentation, so great job with that. And also keep in mind, there's a couple things. The final essay, this Casebook Study essay, is going to be due on May 10th, as well as the final exam is going to be on May 10th. I am going to make the final exam available earlier than that for seniors that need to take the test before the 10th. So any of you that have to have your grades turned in before the normal Crowder May 12th time period, then let me know, and I will give you the password to the final exam, and you can take it earlier. So that is all I have for this week. If you do have any questions, please feel free to send them my way. And otherwise, have a wonderful week. We'll see you in the discussion board. All right, bye-bye.